Why is it so important to read the Bible as one story? When I first started to understand the Bible as one story about 30 some years ago, it dramatically changed a lot of things for me. I've been teaching that to students for well over 30 years and pastors, and in that time I've heard them give a lot of reasons why it's important. Furthermore, we've been able to write drama of Scripture. That book has sold rather rapidly in North America and been translated into 11 different languages. And so I've had many opportunities to be many places in the world talking to pastors and students about reading the Bible as one story. And so I've had a lot of time to think about it in my lecturing, as I've been listening, as I've been writing. And what I'd like to do is pull all of this together. Why for me it's so important, why I've heard from others why it's so important, and try to bring it together in perhaps 6 reasons. And I'm going to move through these 6 reasons from the least important to the most important. The first is the most obvious. What I hear often from members of the church is that I never saw the unity of the Bible before. I grew up in church, I grew up in Sunday school, I heard all of these stories, I knew all of these characters, but I didn't know how they fit together in the bigger picture. I've heard it compared a number of times to a puzzle. I had all the puzzle pieces, but I never saw the whole picture of the one puzzle put together. So there's this sense of excitement of discovery. Now I know where this particular part fits in the Bible. A second thing that I've heard, and this is often from pastors, is that this has helped me interpret the Bible better. Context is, of course, very important for understanding anything in Scripture. Some people have said in hermeneutics the most important 3 things are context, context, and context. And so understanding the biggest context is, of course, going to be essential. And often the context in which we set it, we're unaware and unconscious that that context is not the way the Bible tells its own story. And so I've heard pastors say that it's enabled me to interpret the Bible better, to know where the particular text, the particular book I'm at, where that fits into the story as a whole. A third thing, I've heard this also from pastors, it has enabled me to do theology better. Often, the bigger context in which we are working is our own systematic theologies, our own particular confessional traditions. Now, we all have them, and that's great. But the reality is that all confessional traditions, all systematic theologies, and I don't care which one, they're all partial. They're human constructions, and therefore they often miss big chunks and large parts of the Bible. But we're able to do theology better when we take any particular theme, whether the theme be salvation or the Spirit, and put that into the bigger picture, the bigger story of the Bible. A fourth thing that I've heard from many people is that it helps us to understand the comprehensive demands of the Christian faith. That is, we're called to serve Christ and obey Him in all of life. The biblical story doesn't begin with salvation. The biblical story begins with creation, being made as a certain kind of creature to serve the living God with the whole of our being, not simply in our individual lives and our family lives, but in our corporate, communal lives, that is, in our cultural and social and economic and political and academic lives. In other words, the whole of our lives is to be brought under the lordship of Christ. And when we see the story of the Bible as an unfolding story of God restoring His whole creation, we get a much bigger picture of the comprehensive demands of the Christian faith. And then when our culture wants to squeeze the Bible into this little private area of religious, individual, otherworldly future life, the Bible won't allow it. The biblical story says no. This is public truth about God's world that is being restored and redeemed, and that human beings are called to live the whole of their lives under the lordship of Christ. A fifth reason that I have heard very often, and perhaps this is the one I've heard the most often, is that reading the Bible as one story will keep us from being absorbed into the idolatry of our culture. All of us grew up in some culture, and every culture has a story. And all those stories are comprehensive. They put comprehensive demands on our lives, and we're not even aware of it because we're nurtured into these stories from the very beginning of our lives. And so they just become the normal narrative, the normal way of living in the world. There's a Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know about water, don't ask a fish. Our cultural story is like that water we're swimming in, and we're often unaware of it. The Bible comes along and challenges that cultural narrative and calls us to come live in a story where Christ is Lord rather than the gods that our culture serves. Let me just read a section from you that I wrote in introduction to the drama of Scripture. And a little story behind this little section I'm going to read. The phrase, and I'll mention the phrase when I come to it. One particular phrase the publisher asked me to keep out. He said, it will unnecessarily make your readers a little bit nervous. Perhaps it's a little too confrontive. Take that out. But I ended up keeping in, and I'm glad I did, because this part has been quoted more than any other part of drama of Scripture in blogs and book reviews and other various media. It says this: many of us read the Bible as if it were a mosaic of little bits, theological bits, moral bits, historical critical bits, sermon bits, devotional bits. But when we read the Bible in such a fragmented way, we ignore its divine author's intention to shape our lives through its story. All human communities live out of some story that provides a context for their understanding of the meaning of history and what gives shape and direction to their lives. If we allow the Bible to become fragmented, it is in danger of being absorbed into whatever other story is shaping our culture, and it will thus cease to shape our lives as it should. Idolatry has twisted the dominant cultural story of the secular Western world. And if as believers we allow this story, that is our cultural story rather than the Bible, to become the foundation of our lives, then our lives will not manifest the truth of Scripture, but the lies of an idolatrous culture. Hence, the unity of Scripture is no minor matter. The publisher said, put a period there. But here's what I went on to say. A fragmented Bible may actually produce theologically orthodox, morally upright, warmly pious idol worshippers. In other words, we might have our theological orthodoxy just fine. We might be morally upright. We might be warmly pious in knowing Jesus. And hear me, all three of those things are vastly important. But it could be that we have all of those, but the direction of our lives are being shaped by, say, the consumer idolatry of our culture. And so I've heard many people say that reading the Bible as one story has helped me understand how to confront and challenge the idolatry of my cultural story. And then the sixth reason is this. It helps us to understand the very nature of the Christian faith. There was a book written a number of years ago now, and the title of that book was The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative. It was written by a Yale biblical scholar, and the historical narrative behind that book was this: that the Jews read the Bible as one story and were waiting for an ending to that story. Jesus read the Bible like the Jews. And he said, I am the climactic moment and the ending of the story. And so when he, in Luke 24, when he speaks of the Bible and to those disciples on the road to Emmaus, he's telling the story of the Bible and showing that he is the completing, climactic moment of that story. But also that the church has read the Bible for 1,800 years as one story. Because of the impact of Augustine on church history and his book, The City of God, where he saw the biblical story as the Christian faith over against the cultural story of the Roman Empire. Since that book was the most widely read book in the story of Western Christianity, the church has read the Bible as one story for 1,800 years. But that all changed with the Enlightenment, when a new way of understanding truth, breaking it down to its smallest fragments, based on a way that Newton understood the world in physics. And that way of understanding began to permeate Western culture, and it began to shape the way we read the Bible. And soon we were reading the Bible in terms of its moral bits, its devotional bits, its higher critical bits. But what this author is saying is, the church, for 1,800 years, Jesus and the Jews have read the Bible as one story for a long time. And to return to reading the Bible as one story is not to begin a new theological fad, but it is to return to the way the Bible has been read for most of its history.